This episode and every episode of the Beer Guys Radio Show is brought to you by Ironmonger Brewing. Visit Ironmonger at their taproom in Marietta, Georgia, or online at ironmongerbrewing.com.
Open up a tab, grab a seat, and pour a pint. It's time for the Beer Guys Radio Show.
You want free beer? Go to the brewery.
Dedicated to the art, science, and enjoyment of craft beer.
Yo, what's wrong with the beer we got?
Now, here are your hosts, Tim Dennis and Brian Hewitt.
And welcome to the Beer Guys Radio Show. We're broadcasting for the Beer Guys Radio Studios in Marietta, Georgia. And this week, Brian, we're not even talking about beer.
What?
Right, we are talking bourbon. I am Tim Dennis, and with me, as always, is my good friend and co-host, Brian Hewitt.
Hey, Tim. So joining us today, we have Bruce Tierney, the spirits consultant for DeKalb Bottle House. He's an avid taster, chaser, and collector of a variety of spirits, not to mention a walking encyclopedia of cocktails. He's probably forgotten more about bourbon than I will ever know, Tim. Bruce, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to this evening talking bourbon with you guys.
Bruce, you know, just to get a little kickoff here, we're already sipping some bourbon. What do we start with here? What is in our glass?
Today we're drinking, right now at least, the Elijah Craig standard release. This is a bourbon made by Heaven Hill Distillery, and it's one of the ones that I suggest people who want to introduce themselves to bourbon try, because I think it's a great way to start drinking bourbon.
That sounds good to me. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we've got plenty more. We've got nice basic bourbons to drink. We've got some more allocated stuff for those that know bourbon. Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. We've got
a couple of
appearances there, but I think we're in for a pretty good time.
And we also have a barrel-proof version of Elijah Craig, which would be interesting to try to see how that's different from the standard version.
I like strong bourbons. And so
That's
Booker's is one of my favorites. I really enjoy that. So it's going to be a good time. Brian, I had some bourbon last night.
Did you?
I was sitting around the house with a glass of sweet tea. I was thinking about the show this week, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to put some bourbon in this sweet tea.
Nice.
So
how
was
was
it?
it?
South. It was good. I actually
good.
like it quite a lot. So it was a good time. Bruce, you know, I know there's no point in asking you this question because I've seen your collection. Do you have a go-to bourbon?
I really don't. It's more of a mood thing for me. I choose what feels right at the time, and sometimes that's not even bourbon because my collection covers the spectrum of spirits that exist out there.
Okay. All right. Just have fun with it.
I have seen it. He's got everything. I've seen the layout of by geography, by the region. So yeah,
okay.
He organizes that stuff. Yeah.
Regions and styles, yes, absolutely.
It's impressive.
Brian, did you have any bourbon this week?
I did. You know what? I know Mike Nate had mentioned how a good Old Forester 1910 was and how it was reminiscent of birthday bourbon. I went and bought a bottle of it and tried it and really enjoyed it, and then bought another one for the studio. So we've got that here as well. Yeah.
And we've got a bottle. Bruce, you brought a 1920,
The
right?
1920, which is the higher proof version of that same series of bourbons that Old Forester created several years ago.
Very interesting. Well, as we dive into this more, we're going to get into a little bit of the history of bourbon. We're going to talk about how to taste bourbon, what flavors to look for, some popular bourbons to look out for, some of the big distillers, and just get some basic. This is a bourbon primer.
Yeah,
and an excuse to drink a lot of
an excuse
really nice
to drink
bourbons.
bourbon as a switch up from
just
beer.
As you do, absolutely.
Great. So I think it's time for us to get into the the bourbons of the week.
Now it's time for our Beers of the Week. Brought to you by The Nest, craft beer and barbecue in downtown Kennesaw, Georgia. TheNestKennesaw.com.
As always, we've got a great list to drink, Brian, but it's not beer this week.
Yeah.
We're going to get into these bourbons. And we want to thank The Nest for sponsoring this segment. The Nest has bourbon as well, Brian. They're known for their beer and barbecue, but they've got a bourbon selection there.
I never actually ordered the bourbon there. I did notice that they had it.
They do cocktails, so they are involved with Apotheos Roasters.
Sure.
And they do coffee cocktails there with some of their various
board with
spirits
that, yeah.
And you know what? For those that like coffee, stay tuned because towards the end of this month, we're going to be doing a coffee and beer show with them there. So
it's going to be excellent.
But anyhow, Brian, our bourbons this week, I'm going to mention a few because we have several to try.
A hoarder's collection.
These are the basics, man. Maker's Mark, Woodford Reserve, Buffalo Trace, Wild Turkey 101. But we also have from the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, we have the William LaRue Weller.
That's a hard one to say.
That
Yeah,
was tough,
it
man.
is.
We have a little bit of George T. Stagg. That looks like that bottle may be autographed. Is that right, Bruce?
That's true. It was autographed by the master distiller, but I'm not a picky person. I drink everything. It's not there for show. It's there for drinking.
It's there
Nothing
to
is sacred.
It's
Drink it
there to
all.
drink.
Yeah.
But we've got, a couple more that you mentioned. Just a lot of really nice bourbons to get into. I think it's going to be fun to dive in. I enjoy bourbon, but don't know a lot about it. So it'll be fun to get a little education here, Brian.
Yeah, I'm just down with drinking
Just
some more
down with
bourbon.
drinking bourbon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brian, what is happening this week in the news?
What's in the news? The beer guys have the scoop.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
Time for headlines.
All right, so before I actually get into the news, Bruce had a story that he was telling us about just before that. Bruce, could you give us a quick overview of that story?
Sure. There's a large distillery called MGP, also known as Midwest Grain Products, and they have been a producer of bourbon for other people to bottle, but they're trying to expand their line on the shelf of their own brands, and they purchased another distillery called Luxro, which is just starting to produce whiskey. It's only been in operation for several years, so that's a big new thing.
So we'll start seeing them on the shelves. It won't just be under somebody else's name sometime soon, probably.
That's correct. At some point, we will see them on the shelf under their own names.
Okay, that's cool. All right, so let's get in some beer news. Thanks to craftbrewingbusiness.com for the heads up on this. The Hop Growers of America have released their annual report for 2020, and the total acreage dedicated to hops grew by 3.73% in 2020, though the overall production dropped about 7.29% from 2019. Citra is still king, and it has widened its lead over the other hops in terms of acreage, but not far behind it are Mosaic and Simcoe. Average hop yields in the Pacific Northwest fell in 2020 due to weather, like a severe storm around Labor Day and some heavy smoke cover thanks to a bunch of wildfires. So the production outside the Pacific Northwest was actually up a little bit in 2020.
No surprise that Citra's king. We see it in so many IPAs out there, so it's holding that spot, man.
Everybody wants that Citra. So a bunch of beer menus are going to have to be updated because AB InBev is moving production of Stella Artois to the U.S. by the end of the year. So places that still have import sections on their beer list, which is still funny to think of, but I've seen it recently, they're going to have to scratch off Stella because it's going to be made in the U.S. The cost of moving production to the U.S. will cost the company around almost $300 million, and their reason for doing so is to mitigate the international supply chain issues that the company has faced during the pandemic. So it's been tough for them. While this does seem to be a big deal, some of Stella's labeled products on the shelf are already made in the U.S., like their Midnight Lager. And Stella Artois in the European market will continue to be brewed by AB InBev's facility in Belgium. So it'll still be made there, just not for the U.S. market.
Haven't they had other breweries that did something like that? Was it Kona? That people filed a class action because they said this isn't brewed in Hawaii? Because
they thought it was brewed in Hawaii, and it actually sounded like a frivolous lawsuit, but in truth, I don't think it really was. I think it was brewed in California somewhere. So
yeah, because they're part of Craft Beer Alliance.
It might be. Oh man, I'm
part of that?
I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, they're somewhere along the way. I think it leads back up to AB InBev. So.
But I can bet you that ABI is well aware of these issues, and they will have some kind of verbiage or disclaimer that covers them from that. What
I wonder with the advertising for Stella, because it's always been the European thing, it used to be the pedigree of the guy who came up with Stella Artois and his history a little bit in an advertisement all shiny. I'm wondering if they're going to still advertise it as though it were an import, but never actually say that it's an import. Lead you to believe.
Brewed in the Belgian tradition.
The Belgian tradition, yeah. Shown and Belgian, or foreign locales, but not actually labeled as such. So that's what I'm thinking. So some pretty predictable big game beer stats from Brewbound. Draft sales were down 46% nationwide during the Super Bowl compared with levels during Super Bowl 54, which was last year. And that's on pace with the average decline experienced across the country, according to Beer Board, a company that tracks draft sales at bars and restaurants. In Tampa, Florida, the city that hosted both the Super Bowl and it was the home of the winning team, it saw sales decline by 28.3% last year. Still a decline, not as much as in Kansas City, where draft sales were down 55%. 55% from the previous year. This is draft sales. So
Gotcha.
Interestingly, the light lager style was also down 1.4%, but lagers overall are actually increasing by 0.9%. So people are upping their lager game from light lager to a different kind of lager, Tim.
A different kind of lager.
That's right.
Talking about the draft sales being down and that, I saw a post today that Chicago is starting to loosen restrictions in restaurant dining. And I was thinking, man, being here in Georgia, that's all transparent. We don't see that. It just seems almost business as usual here.
It's been, it's been pretty wide open for a lot of that stuff, for sure. Definitely.
Yeah, well, we've been really responsible here with it, so it's great the way all this has gone.
2 out of every 3 people will even wear a mask, so it's, it's been amazing.
Absolutely. Well, you're listening to the Beer Guys Radio Show. We do need to take a break, But we'll be right back to talk more bourbon.
Have you ever thought about owning your own brewery but don't know what it takes to get one built? We're Storytime Construction, and we build breweries. We're Georgia's most experienced and hands-on contractors when it comes to building new breweries and tap rooms, or expanding existing breweries. We offer full build-outs, remodeling, and additions, as well as consulting and construction management. Give us a call at 770-733-4343. Storytime Construction. We build breweries.
Follow the Beer Guys on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Now, back to the Beer Guys Radio Show.
Welcome back to the Beer Guys Radio Show. Remember, all episodes are available on demand, so if you missed the broadcast, get the podcast. Beer Guys Radio is available on all popular and unpopular podcasting apps. Now let's get back to Bourbon with Bruce.
Bourbon with Bruce. That sounds like a good name there.
Yeah,
Bruce.
I like that, yes.
We were saying, I don't know if you heard us earlier, but we said your catchphrase should be the Bruce is loose.
Yeah.
So if you're not using that...
It has been used before for me, yes.
Good deal. Well, Bruce, bourbon. Where did bourbon start? How did bourbon get started?
There's a lot of mystery surrounding the real origins of bourbon. Bourbon was associated with whiskey that was first made in what was really the Virginia colony before this was a country, and an area known as the Bourbon region of that part of the colony, mostly in what's now present-day Kentucky. And people grew grain, and corn grew better there, and corn was used to make a lot of whiskey as a result of that, rather than rye, which was often used more on the East Coast. So it became a different spirit. And they were making this whiskey basically to, if they had grain left over, they didn't want to waste it, so they would turn it into whiskey, which obviously wouldn't go bad over a period of time. And that was extra income or medicinal purposes, a lot of different ways to use bourbon from those days.
I'd heard one analogy or story of this is a lot of the settlers there coming over from Europe, when they were in, Europe, if they had excess grain, it went to the crown. And they come over here, if they have excess grain, they've got...
There's no crown to send it to, yeah.
And so they're like, it's time to make some whiskey.
And they didn't figure out a way to pickle corn, apparently, so you got to distill it.
Pickled corn. I don't know about that, Brian. I don't know about that.
Well, a lot of them came with their own whiskey distilling traditions, and that's how it became popular for farmers who had to be pretty much self-providing. They couldn't depend on going to the nearest store because there was no nearest store to go to. It was a trading post that might be miles and miles away. So they had to provide for themselves. And a lot of them, the people that were thought to do that was a group called the Scots-Irish, which is a particular group of people. I don't know if we want to get into that here, but and other Scots and Irish people who immigrated to the U.S. during that time period, or the colonies really at that time period.
Okay. And even the name bourbon, like the origins of not just where it came from, but the name is kind of disputed.
Very much so, yes. Like I said, some people relate it to the fact that there was a bourbon county or a bourbon region in that area. But I think Mike Veach, who is a longtime bourbon historian, might have the most reliable story. He's an author of an excellent book called Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey and American Heritage, and has a great deal about American bourbon history, having studied it for a long time. And he believes the name evolved in New Orleans because there were two Frenchmen who went up to Louisville and began shipping whiskey down in charred barrels from Kentucky to New Orleans. And because it was a cheap alternative to French brandy, but it tasted somewhat similar, and it was sold on Bourbon Street, so people would ask for that whiskey from Bourbon Street, and that eventually became people asking for bourbon whiskey.
Bourbon whiskey.
I'd seen or heard something about the popularity of that taking off potentially because of, was it the brandy influence? Because people accidentally stumbled in the fact if you char a barrel, you're getting some interesting character that was very popular with brandy, right?
And there's some debate about charred barrels. A lot of times it was barrels were used to ship something else to Kentucky, and they might have been nails, they might have been pickles, it might have been a lot of things. And so they charred them out to kind of clean them out, and that turned out to make the whiskey taste really good.
They found out that they charring it for cleaning and find out it actually tastes good, because I've always wondered stuff like that. Like, how did we discover distilling? How did we discover that you can take grain, let it ferment? Just discovering beer is pretty interesting, but then to boil it, distill it, get that off of there makes an even better spirit. How do we get from A to Z on this.
I'm guessing somebody left a pot of their beer and like a lid on it. And it dribbled over into another pot, and they drank the liquid off of that. And they're like, "Oh my goodness, this is the greatest thing ever!" And so they're like, "Let's figure out how to do this a million more times."
There is a direct connection between beer and whiskey, of course, because whiskey is just basically beer distilled. In fact, the main vat that whiskey is kept in is called the beer well or the beer mash, which is what then goes into the still, and that's what makes your whiskey. So they definitely have a direct relationship.
A lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the time spent in barrels, but I mean, how important is the mash bill? Because I know in beer, it's all about the ingredients going in, but in whiskey, it always seems like it's all about the time spent in a barrel. And it seems to me like I would think the ingredients going in those specific ratios would probably have a greater influence than the actual time in a barrel.
One might think that, but most of the experts estimate that the barrel provides you about 60% of the flavor that you're getting from
60%
is a result of the aging in the barrel. Now, the recipe certainly makes a difference, whether you're using rye or wheat as your secondary grain. Bourbon, of course, must be primarily corn, but you can use other grains as a secondary flavoring agent. And then, of course, yeast has a big role in it because yeast is used to ferment the grains that you're making, and proprietary yeasts are often used, and they do contribute to the flavor of the product that you're getting.
Do you know what the ABV of like a whiskey mash is? Is it higher? Because I know a lot of yeast are sensitive to high alcohol, so I'm assuming they have to have a special yeast that can ferment that up there.
It's probably roughly 7-8% is what you're getting. It's not very high at all. Oh. And that is an issue. You don't want to get too much alcohol in there because that will distress your yeast and produce potentially bad flavors or maybe kill the yeast.
Right.
I don't claim to be a distiller, but I know that that is the case.
I wonder if anybody's distilled like a Drufontenet Oud Goose.
You can guarantee most anything can distilled.
I really want to try the Oud Goose whiskey now that I'm thinking about it, because you could really distill anything you wanted.
Sure.
And I guess depending on how you distill it, you bring in more or less of the flavor. So
we've had a distillery here, local distillery, IDC, Independent Distilling, which is one of my personal favorite locals. But they did a Bierschnaps with Three Taverns Brewery, and it was really nice. They actually did another
fantastic.
I don't think it was actually a Bierschnaps because I don't think it was a finished beer, but another brewery made like a mash for them. They didn't ferment it all the way out into a beer, but they like made a mash that they then distilled, and it was really tasty, really nice.
The reason for the name Bierschnaps was because there were other ingredients in that particular beer that did not allow it to be called a whiskey once it was distilled.
Okay.
So it was really a matter of the ingredients used beforehand that resulted in the name.
So there are rules about if you can call it a bourbon, but there's also rules about whether you can call it even a whiskey.
Yes.
What kind of rules would you run into?
What makes bourbon bourbon?
Sure.
What makes a bourbon a bourbon?
It's easier to talk about what makes bourbon bourbon than if you don't have those things, you don't have a bourbon. Bourbon, of course, is a whiskey that's distilled from at least 51% corn. And it can be other grains in addition to the corn, but the corn can be higher than 51%. It can be 80%. It can be a very high percentage, or it can be a lower percent, and the flavoring grain can be a higher percentage. It's distilled, and it can't be distilled above 160 proof, which prevents the distillate from getting neutral flavored. It's got to retain some flavor of that mash bill to be a whiskey. You don't want to completely wipe out all the flavor there. And then when it's put in the barrel, it can only be put in at 125 proof. It has to be lowered down to a certain proof before it's aged in the barrel. It can be lower than 125, but it can't be any higher than that level. And then, of course, the kicker with bourbon is that it must then be aged in new charred oak containers. Can't be aged in used containers at all.
You say containers, so they don't even have to be barrels, do they?
I say that specifically because the rule says that they can be that they are containers, and they could be an oak box if one wanted to use that as
a foot locker. It's a charred foot locker made from charred white oak. Yeah.
But of course, all the major distillers use barrels. That's been the standard for a very long time. It's just unique in bourbon and in other straight whiskeys like rye whiskey that it must be new oak that's charred. That's not true for any other whiskey that I'm aware of on a routine basis to have to use new charred oak. It's unique.
That probably explains why we have a variety of bourbon barrels available, like for aging beers and different things.
Sure.
Because you use them once, they're done there, right?
Seriously, there's no recycling. Yeah. It's actually a good thing that you can use it for beer and other things, like maple syrup and things like that
all
too.
Kinds of
more than that, though, they're used for almost every other spirit that spends time in barrels. Rum is aged and used bourbon.
Yeah.
Scotch whiskey, Irish Irish whiskey, tequila, almost everything else is
tequila.
aged in used barrels.
And then coming out of that, Bruce, when they come out of the barrels, it has to be bottled. Is it at 80 proof at least, or at least 80 proof?
That's the minimum proof that a whiskey can be bottled and still be licensed as the whiskey in the United States. That's not true in all countries, but that's the case in the U.S.
Okay. And to be bourbon, it is protected. It has to be made in the United States, but some people mistakenly think Kentucky. That's not the case. It just has to be U.S.
A common misconception. Bourbon can be made anywhere in the U.S., and as you mentioned, we have some made right here at Independent Distilling Company right in Decatur, Georgia. And there's a couple of others making bourbon in the Atlanta area as well.
Good stuff. Well, you're listening to the Beer Guys Radio Show. We do need to take another break, but we'll be back very soon to talk more bourbon.
Brian and Tim, the Beer Guys. If you're like us, no lunch or dinner is complete without a pint or two of craft beer.
Which is why Truck and Tap in downtown Woodstock, Alpharetta, and Duluth are always on our list. Tim, why do they call it Truck and Tap?
Well, the tap part is easy, Brian. They've got 18 of them.
As for the truck part, that's where it gets interesting. Truck and Tap features your favorite Atlanta area food trucks, so you're getting a different menu every day.
Truck and Tap in downtown Woodstock, Alpharetta, and Duluth.
Truckandtap.com. Let them know that the Beer Guys sent you. Looking for great craft beer to enjoy at home? Get your beer to go at the Nest in Kennesaw, Georgia. Choose from their 48 taps to enjoy there with some tasty barbecue, and take some home with you for later. Grab a crispy Pilsner, a nice tart sour, or a bold stout to sit by the fire. Just bring your growler in and choose a favorite or two to take with you. It's our beer, your growler, at the Nest for your brews to go. Check out the beer and food menus before you visit at thenestkennesaw.com.
Follow the Beer Guys on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now, back to the Beer Guys Radio Show.
Shake it back!
Welcome back to the Beer Guys Radio Show. I want to give a quick shout out to our newest radio affiliate, a new one, KIXZ News Radio 940 AM in Amarillo, Texas. Catch Beer Guys Radio on KIXZ every
Sunday.
I think it's
Brian.
Sunday
It is
at 3
Sunday.
p.m. Yeah, but now let's get back to bourbon with Bruce.
Bruce, bourbon. You know, if we had the rights to Amarillo by morning, we'd play that right now. We think we would, but we don't. So we're just going to move on then and talk more about bourbon, man.
I understand.
So we are drinking a bourbon right now as part of what is called the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, correct?
Correct.
And these are allocated bourbons. So Bruce, I think this is a good opportunity to talk about what flavors we're going to look for in a bourbon and maybe how to taste one. Just overall bourbon, what flavors are you going to look for there?
The most common flavors people often describe are caramel, vanilla character, and maybe in an older bourbon, it might get a little bit more leathery. You might get a little bit more woodiness to a bourbon. A younger bourbon might have more sort of tannic flavors to it until it's aged a little bit more. There are some bourbons that have unique fruit flavors. Cherry shows up a lot of times in descriptions of bourbons. And then some bourbons, particularly rye whiskey, which is not a bourbon, but there are high rye bourbons, will have more earthy or nutty flavors or herbal flavors in them that people look for.
I found out that I really enjoy bourbons that are called wheated bourbons or higher wheat. What is the wheat character? What does wheat typically add to a bourbon?
Wheat is softer and sweeter, so you take it with that sweet corn and you're going to get a sweeter bourbon. Usually it's a little easier to drink, and so in that way it might be a better introductory bourbon for someone who's concerned about how harsh it might be at first.
I'm a delicate fella.
Yeah.
So,
I understand that
that's
entirely.
what's going on
So you might
right
get
now.
some more of those butterscotch notes that I get out of some bourbons that are really like hard candy or butterscotch. So I'm on board with the whole wheated bourbon train. I really am.
Well, one good way to better understand that is to look up online and find what's called a tasting wheel. There are some made specifically for bourbon, and that can give you a sense of what flavors you might want to look for. What are the darker flavors? What are the lighter flavors, the fruity flavors, the herbal flavors that can allow you to begin describing what you're tasting. I actually recommend when people first start tasting bourbon to keep notes so that you can remember from one time to the next time what flavors you've tasted.
Are there any common off flavors in bourbons that people want to say? Because I know certain beers are things like, hey, this is, acetaldehyde. You're going to get green apple or whatever. Does bourbon have any that kind of plague it?
There can sometimes be bitterness, particularly in the finish of a bourbon, toward the end of a bourbon, maybe an herbal bourbon that tends to go more bitter towards the end of it, certainly. Older bourbons can get almost ashy, rather than just being wood or leather. Now, there are a lot of people who like that flavor profile, and it's in older and usually more expensive whiskeys that you find it.
When you say older, you're not talking like a bottle that sat on the shelf for 20 years. You're talking older as in how long it's been in the barrels,
That's correct. Bourbon, if it's maintained properly in a bottle, doesn't particularly change over time.
I thought. Okay.
However, every year in the barrel does change. Every day in the barrel really changes the flavor of the bourbon. So an ashy bourbon might be 15, 18, 20 or more years old. And bourbon is more difficult to have high agers than something like Scotch because, one, it's in a new charred oak barrel. Scotch is in a used barrel where some of the flavor is already gone from it. And bourbon is subjected to much greater temperature ranges in Kentucky than Scotch would be in the Highlands of Scotland.
So how important are the temperature ranges when you're aging in a barrel? I mean, what does that do to the spirit inside?
I think it's extremely important because what age does is it moves the whiskey in and out of the barrel itself. You can actually, when you take a barrel apart, you can see how deep into the barrel the whiskey has gone, and that means it's picking up more flavor out of the barrel, and it only does that with greater variations in heat and temperature, whether it be hot or cold. And sometimes whiskeys are kept at the top of a rick house because they get more heat that way, and other whiskeys are kept at the bottom. And then the big distilleries will blend that to create a specific flavor profile that they're trying for.
You know, on that note, Bruce, I saw something. I watched a documentary recently. I think we've all seen it here.
Yeah, we have.
Called Neat, The Story of Bourbon. Really good show, but they talked about kind of the sweet spot in a warehouse and what they were calling the honey barrel. We sampled a little Four Roses single barrel earlier, and I think Blanton's was the first single barrel bourbon, and he got some gruff from other distillers that are like, nah, that's not, bourbon's about consistency, and you can't get consistency in a single barrel like that. So others answered that with small batch or something like that to try and use those quote unquote honey barrels. So with that temperature, I mean, when it's hot, I'm assuming it's going to suck more in, right?
Correct.
Pull more expand the fibers.
Go into
those Kentucky
the liquid
winters
will go into the wood, right?
Yes. Kentucky winters, that's going to contract and push it back more into the barrel. So,
and the single barrel, or even the small batch phenomenon, you have to remember a single barrel is obviously a single barrel. It's the very smallest batch you can have. But small batch is not defined. A small batch might be 10 barrels. It might be 100 barrels, and the distiller decides that's a small batch. And it is for some because they're batching very, very large amounts of barrels. And the argument there was between the blending I was talking about to make a consistent bourbon versus the uniqueness of having bourbon from one single barrel that will not be quite the same as any other whiskey that you're going to have because it came from that one single barrel, and the barrel has such an influence on the flavor of the whiskey.
So like this Four Roses single barrel that we have here, let's say I buy this bottle today, and then 3 years from now I buy another bottle. Those are very likely going to be different whiskeys, correct?
If they're single barrels, they absolutely are going to be different whiskeys.
Yeah, and they should have, I mean, I'm assuming since they're both Four Roses, they're going to have similarities, but going to be some differences as well, right?
Unless they didn't sell all of that barrel and you bought a bottling from that same barrel.
That's why
3 years later.
I'm hoping they can get rid of that in 3 years.
Well, Four Roses is unique because Four Roses makes 10 different styles of bourbon. So you might have 2 different kinds of bourbon and different yeasts that made the bourbon in barrels sitting next to each other. However, I've had barrels from Four Roses that were single barrels that literally sat next to each other from the day they were distilled that are the same recipe, and they taste different. They're not the same.
Differences in wood and where the tree grew when they comprised the wood, basically.
Yeah.
I saw in the documentary you mentioned that when they're making the barrels, they're pulling these staves. They may not be from the same tree. They may be from trees all over the country. So you're getting an interesting blend of the terroir from a lot of different places when you put together a barrel.
Well, a lot of American oak that's used in barrels, it can come from different places. A lot of it comes from kind of the Ozarks region, Missouri, Arkansas area, I think. And there's a big barrel making facility out there that makes those barrels. And Buffalo Trace has a Buffalo Trace experimental collection, different from the antique collection, where they do experiments. And they did the single oak project where they actually kept the barrel or the wood from the same tree in the barrels so that they could have some consistency and control over that, whether it was the bottom of the tree, the top of the tree, the different recipes.
Those things are always fun, stuff like that. I did a cigar tasting where a cigar is blended. Different tobaccos make up most cigars, but this lets you taste the individual components that went into this so you can see how they came together. We've done that.
That's fun.
With beers and stuff. It's fun to do that. So
you'd be surprised how much difference there is from one leaf to the next.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And how they come together once you put it all together. Bruce, I have a beautiful William LaRue Weller in my glass now. I want to sit down with my journal and I want to taste this. What's the proper way to taste this to really assess a bourbon?
If you're tasting to taste rather than tasting to drink,
right,
it's two different things.
Sure.
Hopefully by the time you're drinking it for enjoyment, you've tasted and learned what profiles you really enjoy. But if you're approaching it to taste, there's a whole process that you can go through to try to be consistent every time you taste a new bourbon. And that's a long process. But one of the most important things is to try to have a fresh palate, have not eaten strange things, drunk other bourbons beforehand. Keep notes of what you're doing. Have some water handy to kind of refresh your palate periodically. Maybe if it's a high-proof whiskey, you want a couple of drops. I actually think for the new person drinking whiskey, they really want to probably start with some consistent bourbons from the big distillers, and usually at a lower proof. You don't want to just jump right into a high-proof
Don't
bourbon.
come into the barrel-proof stuff right away.
It sets you right on fire is what it'll do.
And I know aroma is a big portion of taste, and like with beer, you'll just stick your nose there, a wine glass or whatever. Bourbon's hot, so you don't just want to, breathe it in, correct?
But you want a glass that has some, like a chimney effect to it, so you do keep some aroma in there. And you're really looking for the color, the taste, the finish of a bourbon. All of those things play a role in how you perceive and like a bourbon.
Okay.
So when you're actually tasting it, like anything you do with your mouth, because I've heard of people talking about chewing it, like you chew on the bourbon.
And I'm a believer in that when you're first tasting. Get a decent swallow in there. Accommodate yourself to the burn that may come, but let it get all over your mouth, because different parts of your mouth perceive different flavors, and that's a very important thing to do. I agree 100%.
And the first sip on a fresh glass of bourbon is always just going to be hot.
It's going to be hot.
Take another sip.
It depends on your
Drink
palate.
some
In my
water,
palate,
right?
maybe not, but in newer people's palates, perhaps.
The Bruce
so.
is loose,
That's
man.
right.
You got to look
Bruce
out.
is loose.
Well, you're listening to the Beer Guys Radio Show. We do need to take another break, but we'll be back very soon to talk more bourbon.
Craft beer forged with a reverence for tradition and new styles that start a revolution. Ironmonger Brewing. The brewers at Ironmonger Brewing pride themselves at being masters of barrel-aged, hoppy, and sour beers. They invite you to their tap room in Marietta, Georgia to taste and see. Also visit their barrel room for an intimate drinking experience with great live entertainment. Keep up to date on all things Ironmonger by liking them on Facebook. Ironmonger Brewing, establishing a new standard in craft beer.
Follow the Beer Guys on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Cannonball coming.
Now, back to the Beer Guys Radio Show.
Welcome back to the Beer Guys Radio Show. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/beerguys. Patrons get cool perks like Beer Guys swag and commercial-free episodes. You do not get a bottle of bourbon, though.
You don't.
Unfortunately.
Maybe
very
one
sad.
day. We'll see how things go.
It might become legal at some point. Now let's get back to Bourbon with Bruce.
Bruce, we have moved on another in the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, George T. Stagg. Highly sought after, allocated. People literally put their names in lotteries.
They absolutely do.
Right?
And George T. Stagg is kind of the king of that group.
Right.
It's the one that's probably the most popular in the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. They do probably make the most of that one as well, so there's more of it out there. The problem has been over time that more people want it. Restaurants now want it, which they didn't want before.
Sure.
They weren't trying to get it. More people want it because of the name and not because they want to drink it because it's good whiskey, and that's why it's in short supply.
Brian and I there's a beer fest, or used to be a beer fest. COVID may keep it from happening.
Yeah.
But Strong Beer Fest was held at Wrecking Bar Brew Pub here in Atlanta. And 2 years in a row, Brian and I had a tradition. We'd go to the Strong Beer Fest and then park ourselves at the bar and drink whiskey.
That's right.
And we were there. What did we find? Was it the 15 or 12 or something?
So we've got the Van Winkle 10, which is fantastic. Yes. We sat there and finished off a bottle with a couple of friends right there at the bar in the middle of a beer fest. And honestly, I don't regret anything.
They did
no regrets.
They didn't have it on the menu, but we were talking to the bartender, and he's like, "Hey, I've got this," and so we each got a pour of it. And someone said, "Is that Van Winkle?" We're like, "Yeah." Anyhow, long story short, they ended up emptying the bottle just because of that. So,
and I don't begrudge the Van Winkles the popularity of their whiskey now, because there was a long time when they couldn't give it away. It was considered too expensive to be sold as whiskey.
Yeah, still too darn expensive.
And it is, but the price that the Van Winkles charge for it is nowhere near what the price that stores now and secondary markets are charging for it. That's what's made it completely ridiculous.
Do you think even at MSRP, is Pappy 23 worth the cost of admission?
It's a matter of your taste, your profile preference. For me, 23 is a little too old. I would rather drink a 20 or even the 15 rather than the 23. Now, you might want to have the 23 because of its value, although I must put in the caveat that anybody selling whiskey doesn't have a license is breaking the law, but we know it all happens.
Sure, and crazy prices.
I've had both in a taster that spanned all of it that I paid for handsomely years ago. 15 is better.
My favorite has been the 15 as well. So, I mean, you can't meet some things, just the experience has value.
Yes,
Brian
absolutely
and I
true.
this weekend drank a 2,000 bottle of Cuvée Van de Kaiser Blau beer. The beer was past its prime, but the experience of drinking a 21-year-old bottle of a beer that we love was really cool. So, there was that value to it. But
just the idea of thinking back to where you were then, if you could go back and tell yourself that something going into a bottle now, you're going to drink in 20 years.
And Y2K, Brian.
Yeah.
Y2K.
That's
we
right.
thought planes were going to fall out of the sky.
We did.
So.
Like bottles? No.
Yeah. Bruce, we want to offer people some suggestions, people new to bourbon, to get out there. And I think you mentioned that for new people, not just particular bourbons, but maybe certain distilleries.
I did.
You want to hold to, right?
I believe that in order to get a consistent sense of bourbon, you should stick to the major distilleries when you're starting out. And I would look for their bourbons that run in the 90 to 100 proof range. Maybe that's my own personal bias, but 80 proof is just almost like drinking water for me. You're already drinking 60% water in the bottle to begin with.
The Bruce is on the loose.
Yes, I am. But the major distilleries provide the most consistent bottlings, and I talk about a few. Four Roses is one of my favorites.
Sure.
Four Roses makes something called small batch, a lovely whiskey. Most of these ones I'm going to talk about are probably in the $20 to $30 range, at most $40. But if you still find that intimidating to buy a bunch of bottles in that price range, another option, if you have it available to you, is to find a good bourbon bar, because any bourbon bar worth its salt is going to have these basic whiskeys available. And then you can try it by the glass without spending quite so much money.
Same recommendation we give to new people to beer. Find you a good beer bar, go down there, tell them what flavors you like, tell them what you like, and if you've got a good bartender, they're going to help you out. They're going to say, you know what, you need to try this. You need to check this out. So, yeah.
We've already tried another one that I think is an excellent choice. That's Elijah Craig, which is coming from the Heaven Hill Distillery. They also make a wheated bourbon called Larceny, that for those who want to try a wheated style of whiskey, and those are all relatively available and relatively inexpensive.
Larceny is really popular. I keep hearing that name come up a lot.
Do you know, I saw it on the shelves, and to me, the bottle, just judging on visuals only, it looked like a cheap bourbon to me. I don't think the packaging tells you it's a good bourbon.
Packaging may have changed. I think they're now fairly similar to the Elijah Craig bottles in
gotcha.
packaging, unless you find that one to be not appealing as well.
No, Elijah Craig looks nice, actually.
Yeah,
that's distinctive.
I'm looking at it right here.
Yeah.
It looks good to me. Absolutely.
The one most people have heard about is, of course, Buffalo Trace. And the bourbon I would recommend there is the name bourbon, Buffalo Trace. That's the one you can usually find a lot. Now, Buffalo Trace has struggled to maintain their supplies just because they have become so popular, and they're popular for one word, and that's Pappy, because that's where Pappy's coming from. Weller has become super popular because it's been named the poor man's Pappy, because it's the same mash bill essentially. The difference is the Van Winkles are picked into their profile and Buffalo Trace is picked into their profile, and that can be different whiskey even though it's coming from the same mash bill. They're different ages, different things like that.
I can remember getting Buffalo Trace for like $19.99 a bottle.
I can remember it for less.
I know you said that it's different now, but what I know is Four Roses Yellow Label. Then you said it's actually a beige
It's a
label
beige
now,
color
right?
label, but it's still frequently referred to as yellow label.
a
But
yellow
that's
label.
an 80 proof whiskey, and so I tend to encourage people to not go there. I mean, it's a perfectly fine whiskey.
You know what? One thing I like about Buffalo Trace and the Four Roses Yellow Label, I think I've seriously got the Four Roses for like $16 a bottle. We're talking $16 to $20. They were good enough that if I was in the mood to have something neat or over the rocks, I could do that. But they were inexpensive enough that I didn't mind throwing them in a cocktail or even a Coke if I wanted a whiskey and Coke.
And they've now migrated to $20 to $25, but they're still very
affordable,
reasonable
right?
in the terms of the bourbon world as it stands today.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah, considering how expensive some of the Buffalo Traces become, being able to find anything that's like related to it in the $20 range is kind of crazy right now. It's nice that you still can.
Well, Buffalo Trace is the same mash bill that will eventually become George T. Stagg. It's just a matter of where it's aged and the proof that they put on it and how long it's been aged. That's the difference that we're talking about there, picking the profiles.
And I think bourbons are one thing that I think there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily introduced. If you're like me, I grew up in the dirty South, Arkansas, in my young drinking years. Jim Beam was a popular there, so whether it was tequila or whiskey or beer or cigars, I was not introduced to the cream of the crop here. So a lot of people made their first introduction. If you're getting your introduction at the bonfire party on the banks of the Mississippi River, you're not going to have a bottle of George T. Stagg out there.
No,
that's
most likely
just the way
not.
it is, right? So,
but Jim Beam is one of those whiskeys. The Jim Beam White Label, which is their basic whiskey, is one of those 3 whiskeys that you can find almost anywhere in anywhere in the country and almost anywhere in the world. You've got Jim Beam, you've got Jack Daniels, and you've got Johnny Walker, Jim, Jack, and Johnny, and you can find one of those, if not all of them, in any fancy hotel in any place in the world, and sometimes in the the beach bar,
gas station, the grocery store, whatever, right?
Get by on some Johnny Black and some Beam or
you can
whatever.
Make it happen, right?
Yeah.
Now, Bruce, let's say we step it up from here. Maybe we're not ready to pay $600 for a bottle of Pappy. What are some mid-range? If you want to step up your game a little bit.
Sure. The one we just tried earlier, the Elijah Craig barrel proof version, is an allocated bourbon that comes out 3 times a year, but it's findable. And it's in that range, $60 maybe, I think. And that's a very nice tasting bourbon that has some proof to it. So that's one to perhaps look for. Wild Turkey, which is another distillery that many people have heard of, has basic Wild Turkey 101, but they also have the Russell's Reserve line, which is a nicer tasting bourbon for a little bit more money, and one worth pursuing once you've kind of settled on what your flavor profile is. And so that's one I would suggest thinking about as well.
We've got a couple of bottles in front of me that I have to ask because I think they're in that range. The Old Forester 1910, 1920. Are they in that range, or is that a little bit more advanced for people?
No, they're in a similar price range, and they're not super high proof. Only one of those bottlings is up to 115 proof. The rest of them are around 100, either side of 100. And that's one of Old Forester's step-up lines from their basic Old Forester bourbon, which is another excellent, inexpensive bourbon, $25 for a bourbon or a rye that's at 100 proof, and that's very affordable for both drinking and cocktails.
And I mean, there's bourbons that are hard to get that aren't necessarily the $100 bottles or $200 bottles. What is it, Weller 12 or Weller 12?
Well, it used to be around,
yes. Weller 12 and Old Weller Antique, which is now referred to as Weller Antique. They've dropped the old.
Yeah.
Are bottles that people are still looking for.
And the prices aren't bad on them. You just can't find them. Now,
they're not as good as they used to be.
Well, unfortunately, with the internet these days, stores have recognized what the secondary market is, and they've now started marking those bottles in secondary market.
If somebody's going to make the money, the stores are like, why not us?
That's true.
Why not us?
Why not
make
me?
money while the sun shines, I suppose.
Exactly.
Well, we've even seen breweries whose beers were being sold for $500 and $600 on the secondary market. They started offering them in their tap rooms. You know what? If you're going to do it, $500, man. Right?
Yeah, seriously. Why should people who had no influence on the making of the product make all the money off of it? Seriously, raise the price to supply the demand. I get it.
It's been tried, but there has been some consumer pushback on some of the more basic brands.
Sure, absolutely.
Sure. Booker's is an example of that from Jim Beam, where they tried to jack the price up.
They're trying to double it,
and it was pushed back down because of the outcry.
I remember that. Tried to go up crazy, exactly.
Yeah.
Bruce, we are out of time here, sir. Any parting thoughts here on all of this?
My parting thought would be get out there and try some bourbon. Try some basic
bourbon.
stuff
Easy
and find
enough.
out what you like, and then go from there.
Good stuff. Y'all, we have got a lot more information to share, but we don't have time to do it. Please check our website at beerguysradio.com. We're going to have a lot more info in the show notes here. That wraps it up for this show. We appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to join us next week. We're going to be talking with Microphone Brewing.
Microphone.
Yes, thanks for tuning in. Have a great week, and do not forget to drink local. Cheers.